In a winter season defined by isolation, shortages, and uncertainty across the frontier, one quiet development has captured the attention of communities from Kansas to Wyoming. The unexpected arrival of a young mail-order bride whose story, until now, remained largely unknown. Reports from the remote settlement suggest that her appearance on Christmas Eve and the reaction of the rancher who had sent for her months prior has sparked both curiosity and reflection among neighbors who rarely agree on anything at all. What follows is an investigative account of how a woman with nothing but a carpetbag, a faded letter, and a trembling sense of hope stepped off a stagecoach into a life she could not have predicted. Witnesses who were present at the small, frost-covered depot described the moment with surprising consistency. The stagecoach had been delayed nearly 4 days due to snowdrifts along the northern pass, and by the time it rolled into town, horses panting clouds into the air, no one expected passengers to emerge. But a single young woman stepped down, gripping the rail with half-frozen fingers, her shoes cracked, her dress threadbare, and her expression caught somewhere between fear and determination. Her name, as later confirmed through correspondence, was Clara Whitcomb, age 21, formerly of St. Louis, where she had lived as a seamstress before hardship forced her westward. Local residents admit they initially mistook her for a traveler who had lost her way or perhaps a relative unexpectedly visiting for the holiday. But in the brief silence that followed her arrival, she reached into her carpetbag and produced a folded letter addressed in the recognizable handwriting of Thomas Avery, a rancher known for his reclusive nature, his long hours of work, and his tendency to avoid anything that did not directly involve livestock. The townspeople, hearing the name, exchanged glances that were at once curious and protective. Avery was respected, certainly, but he was also a man who rarely spoke more than was necessary, and no one had imagined him to be the type to participate in mail-order arrangements. As Clara stood waiting, blinking against the cold and the steady swirl of snow, it became clear that Avery himself had not been notified of the stagecoach's revised schedule. A telegraph had been sent, but never delivered due to downed wires along the eastern ridge. And so, for nearly an hour, she remained at the depot with only the murmurs of townsfolk and the distant ringing of church bells from the Christmas service as company. Observers later remarked that despite her obvious exhaustion, she held herself with a quiet resolve, as though she had endured so much already that another hour of uncertainty was simply another chapter she was willing to survive. Multiple sources describe her backstory as one shaped not by recklessness but by necessity. A harsh economic downturn in the city had left her without steady work, and the boarding house where she lived raised its rates without warning. The mail-order bride advertisements, common throughout frontier newspapers, offered what looked like an escape, though not without its own risks. Clara exchanged letters with Avery for 3 months before committing. Her friends, she reportedly said, told her she was foolish. But she insisted that sometimes it takes more courage to step into the unknown than to cling to a life that is already sinking. When Avery finally entered the depot, brushing snow from his coat and scanning the room with a guarded, almost wary expression, those present reported witnessing a shift so subtle yet unmistakable that several mentioned it independently. The rancher, long regarded as stoic and emotionally impenetrable, paused in the doorway as his gaze fell on the young woman clutching his letter. His posture stiffened, his breath caught, and he took several seconds before approaching her. Some interpreted his hesitation as confusion. Others believed it was something else entirely. Perhaps the realization that the abstract idea of a bride had transformed, in an instant, into a living, shivering woman depending on him. Clara's voice, when she offered a quiet greeting, was described as fragile but unwavering. Avery's reply, however, surprised everyone. Though few could hear the exact words, those close enough reported that his tone was not the curt, businesslike one he used in town, but something more tentative, almost gentle. He offered her his coat before she could protest, and when he asked whether she had eaten, the question hung in the air with the weight of a man discovering an unexpected truth. The stranger he had summoned to his isolated ranch was not merely fulfilling an agreement, but stepping into a future with no guarantee of acceptance, safety, or even warmth. The reactions from townsfolk varied. Some whispered that Avery had been foolish to send for a bride, especially during a season when weather threatened all forms of travel. Others felt sympathy for Clara, whose slight frame and worn shoes made it clear she had endured far more than a difficult trip. A few noted the striking contrast between her vulnerability and Avery's rugged appearance, remarking that fate had an odd way of pairing opposites. One observer said it was the first time they had seen Avery appear unsure of himself, as though the responsibilities of ranching were simple compared to the arrival of a woman who expected not comfort, but a chance at stability. The depot lanterns flickered in the growing wind. Avery gathered Clara's small belongings and escorted her outside. Witnesses noticed he matched his pace to hers, slowing whenever she faltered in the deepening snow. Though no formal vows had been exchanged and no certainty existed about what future awaited them, the moment carried an unspoken significance. A rancher known for weathering storms alone was suddenly responsible for someone whose presence exposed vulnerabilities he had long kept hidden. Townsfolk watched their silhouettes fade into the snowy dark, and many later admitted that they felt a strange sense of anticipation, as though they had unknowingly witnessed the beginning of something meaningful. Further investigation reveals that Avery had originally placed the advertisement after losing his mother earlier that year. Her absence left a quietness in the ranch house that he had not anticipated, and though he would never openly confess to loneliness, those who knew him sensed he was carrying more than labor on his shoulders. Clara's letters, according to Avery's close acquaintance, had struck him with their sincerity. She did not flatter him, nor did she paint a romantic picture of frontier life. Instead, she spoke plainly of her circumstances, her willingness to work, and her desire for a home where kindness outweighed luxury. Avery, it seems, responded to truth rather than embellishment. By the time Clara and Avery reached his wagon that night, the snow had intensified. She later described the sound of the wind as both haunting and reassuring, because despite the unknowns ahead, she was no longer standing alone on a platform waiting for help that might never come. Avery lifted her carpet bag into the wagon bed with a care that contradicted his reputation, and when he helped her step up beside him, she noticed something unexpected. His hands trembled slightly, suggesting that she was not the only one confronting a new and uncertain chapter. As they set off toward the ranch, the bells from the distant church continued to echo faintly through the valley. The timing, several witnesses later reflected, seemed almost symbolic. Most families were gathering inside warm homes, preparing for a night of celebration. Yet here were two strangers starting a journey under the cold stars, bound not by familiarity, but by the fragile thread of shared hope. What no one could have predicted that night was how profoundly their lives would change within the next 24 hours, and how the simple act of a rancher looking at his mail-order bride on Christmas Eve would reshape their understanding of blessings. As the story unfolded across the prairie town of Red Creek, the most surprising testimonies didn't come from those who knew the rancher well, but from the few who had encountered the mail-order bride in the weeks before Christmas Eve. Locals described her as quiet but not timid, a woman who carried herself with a fragile dignity despite clearly having been worn down by years of disappointment. Her arrival on the afternoon stagecoach had stirred more whispers than the town had heard in months, mainly because she stepped out with nothing but a single cloth bag, a thin shawl, and a look in her eyes that seemed to plead with life to give her just one more chance. Reporters attempting to piece together her past found a trail that was not so much hidden as it was ignored, simply because nothing about it screamed for attention. Neighbors from her former town described her as the kind of woman who existed between life's margins, never causing trouble, never raising her voice, never demanding more than scraps of kindness when others would have insisted on fairness. Her upbringing had been marked by scarcity, so persistent it had become normal for her to feel grateful for half portions and silent consideration. Yet the letters she sent westward, eventually received by the rancher who chose her name from a stack of envelopes, contained a tone that stunned those who later read them. She wrote with a voice full of unbroken hope, not the tone of a woman defeated, but one who still believed life might be coaxed into gentleness. That unwavering hope became the center of conversation around Red Creek as residents recollected their first impressions. She was clearly nervous stepping off the stagecoach, hands shaking as she held her bag, eyes scanning the crowd of unfamiliar faces. But even in that tension, witnesses recall a kind of fierce determination. She was here to build a life, no matter how difficult the beginning. What struck Minnie most deeply was that she didn't look for the rancher first. Instead, she looked for stability, searching for any sign that her long journey had not been in vain. Her future husband noticed this from the edge of the crowd, sensing before he approached that she was someone who had not been treated gently, but had somehow remained gentle. The rancher himself was a man of few words, shaped by harsh winters, long days of labor, and a life lived mostly in the company of cattle and wind. Yet something in him softened the moment he saw her, something he later admitted surprised even him. He walked toward her with a hesitancy that seemed almost boyish, as if afraid she might vanish if he approached too quickly. Those who witnessed the interaction said the look in his eyes was not one of ownership or expectation, but a careful recognition that the woman standing before him was not just a bride delivered by post, but a person placing her future entirely in his hands. Their first conversation, though short, was recalled by the rancher in interviews years later. He said she looked at him with an apologetic expression, as though sorry for arriving with so little, for not being the sort of bride novels promised, for not bringing with her beauty polished by privilege. But he had seen enough of life to know that some blessings came disguised in modest wrapping. He offered her his hand and spoke gently, something the town remembered with astonishment, since softness had never been one of his public qualities. She accepted his hand with visible relief, and together they walked toward the wagon that would take them to the ranch, beginning a partnership neither of them yet understood. For the first few days, locals assumed the arrangement would unfold like many mail-order marriages in the West, quietly, practically, without affection or fanfare. The town expected necessity to be the driving force, not romance or emotional connection. Yet rumors slowly spread that something unusual was happening on the ranch. Workers reported seeing the rancher linger near the house more than usual, finding reasons to check fences closer to the porch, taking time to show her how tasks were done instead of simply assigning them. She, meanwhile, was said to move through her new surroundings with a mix of wonder and cautious optimism, taking special note of every gesture of respect he showed her, no matter how small. Those who visited the ranch over the next weeks reported a subtle but unmistakable shift in the household. She began cooking meals that reminded the rancher of a childhood long overshadowed by adult burdens. He, in turn, began repairing corners of the house he had ignored for years, as though seeing them through her eyes revealed neglected opportunities to create comfort. Their interactions were quiet, but the silence they shared was no longer awkward. It was peaceful, the kind that forms when two people begin to understand each other without needing constant words. By mid-December, reports suggested that the town's initial skepticism was fading. Even the harshest critics, those who believed mail-order marriages were little more than transactions, began to admit that there was an unusual calmness surrounding the couple, a harmony rarely achieved even in long-established marriages. The rancher, who had once been known for working until exhaustion, now returned home earlier, sometimes bringing her small gifts he pretended were practical necessities but were clearly chosen with care. A scarf, a warmer shawl, a pair of wool socks she later clutched the way a child might hold a cherished keepsake. As Christmas approached, people who observed them from a distance sensed an emotional deepening between the two. The rancher, who had once feared attachment because it invited heartbreak, found himself drawn to her steady resilience. She, who had once lived quietly so as not to disturb the world around her, began to show hints of laughter and ease that seemed new even to herself. The transformation on both sides was subtle but undeniable. All of this came to a head on the eve of Christmas, a night normally reserved in Red Creek for reflection and community gatherings. While most families congregated around fireplaces or church halls, the rancher and his bride remained at home, tending to simple tasks in the warm glow of lantern light. According to accounts he later shared, it was then, amid the ordinary rhythm of daily life, that he saw her in a way he never had before. Not as the woman he agreed to marry out of mutual need, not as the quiet traveler who stepped off the stagecoach with nothing but hope, but as a blessing he had not dared believe he deserved. Witnesses in town recalled seeing him the next morning, a man visibly changed, as though a weight had lifted from his shoulders. He spoke to neighbors with a softness they had never heard from him. And though he did not share every detail, it became clear that something profound had occurred the night before, an unspoken exchange of trust, gratitude, and the beginnings of genuine love. That moment, later retold countless times, marked a turning point in both their lives. It was the moment the rancher understood that blessings do not always arrive with flourishes or grand announcements. Sometimes, they step off a dusty stagecoach wearing a worn shawl and carrying nothing but hope, waiting for someone to see them for what they truly are. What unfolded in that quiet corner of the frontier on Christmas Eve would later be described by neighbors, churchgoers, and even passing ranch hands as something astonishing, something that did not quite belong to the harshness of the land or the scarcity that defined most lives. It was something softer, quieter, almost unbelievable to those who had known the groom's reputation for solitude. When he looked at the woman who had stepped out of the wagon wearing nothing more than borrowed courage and a patched dress, something changed, not only in him, but in the atmosphere of the cabin itself. And people who told the story years later swore they had never seen a man's face shift like that, as if a lifetime of loneliness had suddenly found a counterpoint. By the time word spread that he had accepted her into his home, not out of duty, but with a look witnesses described as reverence, it was already clear the community had taken an interest in their strange, tender pairing. The man known for being quiet as snowfall and twice as hard to read had shown signs that even he did not recognize in himself. As the wind picked up outside and the lantern light flickered across the small cabin walls, the moment took on the shape of a beginning that neither of them had dared to hope for. Neighbors later said they could sense something shift in the world that night, the way a cold season gives the faintest hint that spring will someday return, even before the ice begins to thaw. Inside the cabin, he observed her with an attentiveness that surprised him. Her hands trembled faintly as she warmed them near the stove, and the sight caused something protective to rise inside him, something he had not felt since he was a young man helping his mother mend winter coats. The journalist reporting the story would later write that what moved him most was not her vulnerability, but the way she tried to hide it, as if afraid that her sincerity might be judged or dismissed. There was something profoundly simple, yet deeply human in the way she clasped her fingers together as if holding them still might hold her life together. She had traveled far, farther than most women dared to venture, chasing a future built on the slimmest thread of hope. And when she finally spoke about her journey, her voice was soft but carried the echoes of every hardship she had endured. She described the town she had passed through, the whispers she had overheard, the doubtful looks thrown her way whenever she explained she was heading west to meet a man she had never seen. She spoke of sleepless nights spent listening to the creak of wagon wheels, of hunger that had hollowed her more than she wanted to admit, and of moments when the cold felt like an enemy she could not outrun. That he listened, not merely nodding, not merely waiting for his turn to speak, but listening with a kind of stillness that made her feel for the first time in years that her words mattered. The reporter would later note that she had grown used to speaking into emptiness, first to parents too exhausted to hear her dreams, then to strangers willing to take her coin but not her dignity, and finally to the void of the prairie sky that offered no reply at all. But this man, this stranger who was now her husband in name if nothing else, gave her something she had long believed she would never receive: attention unmarred by judgment. The stove's warmth filled the cabin, melting the chill that had clung to her clothes and skin. He placed a cup of warm broth into her hands, and she accepted it with a gratitude that was palpable. She had arrived with nothing, no family, no possessions beyond a small bundle of letters and the faintest remnants of faith. And yet in that moment, she felt richer than she had in years. He did not crowd her with questions, nor did he retreat into the silent stoicism that had once been his shield. Instead, he seemed to be studying her with a mixture of caution and wonder, as though he feared any sudden movement might break the fragile trust forming between them. Later accounts from townsfolk who saw them from afar described seeing light glowing from the cabin windows in a way that almost looked like warmth spilling into the night. Some said they imagined they heard faint laughter drifting across the snow, though neither of them remembered laughing. Perhaps, as one elderly neighbor suggested years later, it was the laughter of a house that had gone too long without companionship. Homes, she believed, could hold memories and release them when they felt safe again. As she spoke, she admitted her greatest fear, not that he would treat her unkindly, but that he would regret choosing her. The admission came out suddenly, as though it had been trapped behind her ribs for far too long. She explained that she had often been made to feel like an afterthought in other people's lives, as if she were something to be tolerated rather than welcomed. She feared he might see her the same way once the novelty of her arrival faded. His response was quiet, but carried the weight of honesty. He told her that he had not sent for a bride out of desperation, as rumor had long suggested, nor out of a desire to own or control another human soul. He had done it because he wanted companionship, someone to speak to at the end of the day, someone who wouldn't look at him with suspicion or expectation. He confessed that he had feared no woman would willingly come to such a remote frontier with a man like him, a man whose life was full of long days and longer silences. When her letters arrived, he said, they had been the first warmth he'd felt in years. The journalist writing their story noted that it was in this moment, this quiet exchange of fear and sincerity, that the turning point occurred. She realized he did not view her as a burden but as a blessing, not as a transaction, but as someone whose presence might soften the edges of his world. And for him, her arrival was not the fulfillment of a practical need, but the unexpected gift of companionship that he had almost believed he did not deserve. Outside, snow began to fall, settling over the small property with the softness of a prayer. And though they were only beginning to learn one another's rhythms, the night no longer felt empty. The reporter wrote that the two of them, sitting in the small cabin, illuminated by nothing more than lamplight and the warmth of simple broth, looked like a portrait of what hope can build when everything else has been stripped away. He looked at her as though seeing something sacred, something he had not known he needed until the moment it arrived. And she, who had spent so much of her life feeling expendable, finally felt seen. Neighbors would say in later years that this was the night the rancher changed, not because he gained a wife, but because he finally allowed someone into the quiet chambers of his heart. And for her, it was the night she stopped being a woman with nowhere left to go and became, instead, a woman finally chosen. Christmas Eve ended not with fanfare, not with grand declarations, but with two people learning that hope, no matter how fragile, no matter how faint, can still choose the most unexpected places to settle. The fourth part of this unfolding account explores the subtle but powerful shift that happened once Thomas and Clara began to understand each other, not as contractual participants in a fragile arrangement, but as two human beings quietly reshaping one another's worlds. Christmas Eve had already changed something fundamental between them, but the days that followed revealed what was truly at stake. Two lives that had long been defined by duty, grief, disappointment, and isolation were slowly being rewritten into something resembling companionship, trust, and maybe, in time, something even deeper. From the outside, it looked like a small rural household going through ordinary winter routines. But beneath the surface, every moment carried weight, meaning, and a sort of gentle discovery that neither Thomas nor Clara had anticipated. Clara woke each morning with the cautious hope of someone who still feared the ground might shift beneath her if she allowed herself to relax. She moved through her chores with diligence and quiet competence, always aware of Thomas watching her in a way that felt neither demanding nor suspicious. Instead, he watched with a kind of attentiveness that suggested he was trying to learn her, to understand her rhythms, her unspoken anxieties, and the subtle ways she tried to make herself useful without appearing intrusive. This was still a new place, a new life, and as grateful as she felt, she couldn't forget how precarious her position had once been. Women like her rarely received second chances. Mail-order brides carried reputations shaped by other people's assumptions. Yet Thomas never treated her as anything less than a partner whose presence mattered. For Thomas, the shift was equally profound. He had expected a wife in name only, a practical arrangement, someone to help with the home, maybe with the ranch, someone who would occupy the quiet spaces of his otherwise solitary days. He had not expected a woman whose gentleness made the house warmer or whose quiet thoughtfulness changed the very way he moved through his responsibilities. He noticed now that he woke earlier, not from habit, but from anticipation. He listened for her soft footsteps in the kitchen, for the way she hummed under her breath when she kneaded dough or stirred the morning porridge. These sounds, once unimaginable in the silence of his home, became markers of comfort. He realized he had begun to rely on them more than he intended. Ruth, Thomas's daughter, observed these changes with a sensitivity far beyond her age. Children often recognized emotional shifts before adults did, and Ruth saw clearly that Clara made her father stand differently, breathe differently, speak with a softness she had not heard in years. Clara did the same with Ruth, offering patience that was never forced, attention that never wavered, and kindness that felt instinctive rather than strategic. The girl began to seek her out more often, bringing her small questions, childhood curiosities, or simply lingering beside her while she worked. Clara, who had long feared she would never have the chance to build a family of her own, felt these moments settle deep within her like something precious she couldn't dare to name. The community, initially skeptical of the marriage, slowly shifted in its judgment. The early weeks had been filled with whispers, another man buying a bride, another woman desperate enough to agree. But winter had a way of revealing truth. It showed who endured, who worked hard, who kept commitments in the coldest months. Clara proved herself quickly, not by trying to impress the town, but simply by living with sincerity. She greeted everyone she met, helped where she could, and remained steadfastly kind even to those who had greeted her with suspicion. By late January, the whispers had changed. She was hardworking, respectful, dependable, and above all, she seemed to bring a gentler atmosphere to the ranch. Thomas noticed it too, though he would never admit it out loud. He found himself thinking before speaking, softening his tone, reconsidering the harsh habits he had developed over years of grief and isolation. He became a man who paused long enough to listen, a man who considered feelings as much as schedules. Clara didn't ask for these changes. She didn't even hint at them. But he changed because something inside him recognized that the home she was gently building deserved more than his old self. She brought a lightness he didn't know how to name, and instead of rejecting it, he simply let it happen. Despite this growing closeness, Clara carried quiet fears. Her past had been shaped by disappointments. People who promised stability then withdrew it. People who valued her only when she performed perfectly. She worried sometimes that Thomas was being kind merely because of duty, that he saw her as something fragile rather than someone equal. She worried she was reading too much into his softened expressions, his willingness to seek her opinion, the moments his hand brushed hers at the dinner table and lingered a second longer than necessary. She didn't want to misinterpret kindness as affection. She didn't want to risk her heart on assumptions. Thomas had fears of his own. The loss of his first wife had left him cautious, grieving not just the woman he loved, but the version of himself he had been with her. Open, trusting, hopeful. He feared failing again, feared offering too much too soon, feared that if he revealed the fullness of what he was beginning to feel, she might withdraw or become overwhelmed. He respected her courage in coming all this way. He admired her resilience more than she knew. But he also knew she needed time, space, and the assurance that she wouldn't be pressured into becoming something she wasn't ready to be. This mutual caution created a delicate dance between them, a growing connection both of them felt, yet carefully protected. Each small gesture mattered because each gesture came from a place of genuine, emerging affection. When Clara mended one of Thomas's worn shirts, he thanked her with a sincerity that made her chest warm. When Thomas replaced the drafty window in her room, she responded with gratitude that made his throat tighten. These weren't grand gestures. They were the simple, human acts that build real family, real trust, real intimacy. By late winter, the ranch itself seemed to recognize the change. The work felt lighter, the air warmer, the evenings gentler. Clara and Thomas found that they talked more, not about obligations or tasks, but about memories, dreams, and fears they had kept hidden from the world. They were still cautious, still figuring out what they were becoming, but neither denied that something was quietly, steadily taking root between them. What began as a necessity was turning into a partnership, and what started as mere hope was slowly transforming into something that felt like belonging. What surprised Eleanor most in the days leading up to Christmas Eve was not how much work there was to do on a ranch, nor how unfamiliar the routines were. It was how natural everything slowly began to feel. The wind no longer intimidated her. The vastness no longer swallowed her thoughts, and the quiet nights no longer made her uneasy. Instead, she found herself drawn into the rhythm of the place, breathing with it, stitching her hopes into it like the hem of a garment she'd worn her whole life. Wyatt, without ever saying it outright, had begun to trust her, or at least rely on her. He handed tasks to her without careful instructions, simply gesturing toward a fence that needed checking or a horse that needed walking. He didn't hover, didn't question whether she could manage. He just expected that she would. And every time she succeeded, a small warmth bloomed in her chest, the kind that comes only from finally being seen as capable. But there was something else quietly taking root between them, delicate as a sapling trying to grow in winter conditions. Wyatt wasn't a man who said kind things lightly, but his actions spoke where his words did not. When she returned from chores with her fingers stiffened from cold, he swapped out her gloves for a warmer pair he insisted she keep. When he noticed her lingering near the window on nights she felt homesick, he made excuses to bring his ledger to the table closest to her so she wouldn't sit alone. And whenever she smiled and looked away, afraid of revealing too much, he looked at her a second longer, as though memorizing something he didn't want to miss. Still, Eleanor kept her heart hesitant. People who come from very little learn to be grateful for scraps, and she was terrified that what she saw in his eyes was simply politeness, softened by Christmas spirit and the novelty of having company. It had been easy to grow hopes in the letters they exchanged before she arrived. Words on paper allow a soul to stretch wider than reality sometimes permits. But now that she was here, flesh and bone, ordinary and imperfect, she feared she had no right to expect anything more than a roof and understanding that on the morning of Christmas Eve, the ranch seemed to wake early. The cold bit harder, the sky hung low with a soft gray, and the horses moved slowly, sensing snow on the air. Wyatt came into the kitchen while Eleanor was kneading dough, brushing a dusting of flour from his sleeve as he watched her with quiet concentration. He often did that now, paused in the doorway with a gaze that made her heart flutter even when she wasn't looking directly at him. "You don't have to make all that," he said gently. "A simple supper would be fine." She shook her head, smiling despite herself. "It's Christmas, Wyatt. Even a small supper should feel like something." He nodded, though emotion flickered in his eyes, gratitude, perhaps, or something deeper that she still didn't dare name. He stepped closer, picking up the rolling pin she had set aside and testing its weight in his hand, as though searching for a reason to stay near her a little longer. She pretended not to notice, but felt her breath catch anyway. Later that afternoon, as she walked toward the barn, she noticed him repairing a gate alone. He worked quietly, but with a heaviness she couldn't ignore. Something in the way his shoulders tensed told her that his thoughts were somewhere else entirely, somewhere painful. She approached him slowly, careful not to press too deeply into places he had not yet offered her entry. "Wyatt," she said softly, "you've been quiet today." At first he didn't answer. Then, without looking up, he wiped his hands on his trousers and exhaled. "Christmas was my wife's favorite day," he said simply. "She made this place feel alive at a time of year when everything sleeps." Eleanor's chest tightened. She had known he was a widower, of course, but he rarely spoke of the woman he had loved. The sorrow in his voice was not raw but settled, the kind that time does not erase but teaches a man to carry. "You don't have to explain," she said. "Grief doesn't run on a calendar." He lifted his gaze to her then, the winter light catching the rough angles of his face, softening them. "No," he said, "but it feels different this year." Her breath stilled, and she waited. For what? She wasn't sure. "It feels less empty." The words landed between them so quietly she wondered if she'd imagined them. But he didn't turn away. He watched her as though hoping she understood that the emptiness had not been filled by noise or activity, but by her presence alone. And she, standing there with cold fingertips and a heart suddenly too warm, felt something shift. Not a spark, not a surge, but a settling, as if something long displaced had finally come home. That evening, the ranch slipped into a soft, quiet stillness. Snow had begun to fall in feather-like flakes, gathering along the fence posts and drifting across the fields. Eleanor lit a lantern on the dining table and laid out the simple meal she had prepared: roasted vegetables, bread still warm from the oven, and a small apple tart she'd hoped would taste better than it looked. When Wyatt stepped inside, brushing snow from his coat, he paused at the sight. The lantern light glowed across the table, and the warm scents filled the room like something sacred. He removed his hat slowly, almost reverently, and Eleanor felt suddenly self-conscious. afraid she had overdone it or made a fool of herself by trying too hard. But he only looked at her the way a man looks at the first sunrise after a long winter. "You did all this?" he asked, his voice low. "It's not much," she murmured. "But I wanted the evening to feel like something special." "It does," he said. "It already does." They ate together quietly, though not in silence. Wyatt asked her about her childhood Christmases, how she'd spent them, what she'd wished for, what she never received. She told him about winters in the small, drafty house she grew up in, and how she'd always hoped for a home that felt warm not because of firewood, but because someone cared whether she was cold. When she finished, she expected him to pity her, but he didn't. He simply absorbed every word as though her past mattered deeply because she did. After dinner, she gathered their plates, but Wyatt rose at the same moment and stopped her with a gentle hand at her wrist. She froze, not because of the touch itself, but because of the way he held her eyes afterward, like he was trying to tell her something without speaking.